Alrighty, thank you everyone for joining Enhanced Prep's ACT Super Review. Let's jump into it. We're going to go over all the helpful tips and tricks for every single strategy of the ACT. All right, so just a quick background on myself. I have over 7 years of professional tutoring experience, primarily in SAT and ACT prep, so I definitely got your back. I know this test inside and out. I also have some experience as a classroom teacher, as well as a mentor. I graduated from NYU from my bachelor's, and I graduated from Columbia University for my master's in teaching. And some of my passions include food, dogs, and fitness. Okay, so let's talk really quickly just about what it means to be applied to a college that's test optional, test blind, and how the ACT plays into that. We've seen a lot that ever since COVID-19, a lot of schools went test optional. Now a lot of schools are going back to not test optional. There's still a good amount of schools that held on to the test optional status. But keep in mind, if they say test optional, they will still evaluate your score. They're going to see it as basically your dedication. They're going to look at your academic curiosity, and they're going to look at it in terms of scholarship money. So when they say test optional, you don't have to send a score, but if there's another student with very similar backgrounds, a similar transcript, GPA, similar extracurriculars, but they submit a strong score, the school is going to pick them over you. So test optional is actually more like test recommended. If a school says test blind, that's when they will not look at your score. You can send them a perfect score. They will not look at it, or at least they're not supposed to. Test optional means they are absolutely looking, and it's going to make it a little bit more competitive because more students are applying for that reason. Also, if any questions come up, please let me know. You can go ahead and send it in the chat, raise your hand. I got your back. Any questions at all? Okay, so let's keep going. For today's agenda, we're going to go over the structure of the ACT because usually uncertainty about that adds to anxiety. We'll go over strategies and practice them for every section of the test, and then we'll talk about what comes next and have a little bit of time for questions and answers at the end. Okay. So a few reasons that the ACT can be a bit challenging, and those of you who have taken it or who have taken any practice tests, you already experienced this. It's a long test. You usually don't take tests this long in school, so endurance is a huge part of it. Usually the best way to build that up is to practice it over time. Try not to do it like every other day or every single week. That's overload. But it is helpful to practice the phrasing of it. Sometimes the way they ask these questions is just like, what did they even say? So practicing for the ACT is almost like learning another language in a sense. You're learning how the ACT speaks, which also requires a bit of practice. And then there's incorrect trap answers. Typically in school, your teachers are not putting a bunch of traps throughout the test. That kind of defeats the whole purpose of seeing what you learned. This test is not a true measure of what you've learned in school. It's more of like who can play the game better, the people who make this test or you. So I'm going to help you spot some of those traps so that we can win and not them. It's also scored on a curve, which you cannot predict. It just depends on how everyone does that day. And it's also not, like I mentioned before, it's not a true sign of what you've learned. It's not a true, you could be a pro in slope, but they'll ask it in the weirdest way possible, and it might throw you off. It doesn't mean you don't know the slope formula. They just asked it in a weird way. The other thing is, it doesn't really match up with what you learned in school recently, right? I'm curious, what grade are you all in? If you can go ahead and send me a quick chat. Right, Maribel, I saw you raised your hand. Feel free to either unmute or you can send a chat. Okay. In the chat, you can send it directly to me as well. Rising senior. Okay, yes. So I'm seeing a few, yep, rising seniors. Okay, gotcha. So you're about to be a senior. It's probably been a minute since you looked at the things you've learned in like eighth grade or ninth grade, right? So with that in mind, that's part of the challenge. You're trying to remember what you've learned years ago. And I remember when I was in high school, whenever I took a test, the next month that knowledge is gone. Like I don't really truly remember it the way that I did a month ago. Now you're supposed to remember what you learned like 3 years ago. So a lot of the times you just need to refresh it, but it's nothing you cannot handle. That's what you need to keep in mind. Okay. Now, in terms of the different sections, the English is primarily focused on grammar and punctuation, although there's other question types as well. In the math, it's very, very much heavy on algebra. That makes up the majority of it. Yes, geometry and trig is there, but not a whole lot. For trig, the majority of it is SOHCAHTOA until you get to like the very, very end of the test. For the reading section, you have passages and questions. You have 4 passages, 10 questions each, but it's not the same kind of reading you're doing, especially not what you've done throughout your junior year of high school, where you're supposed to think deeply, analyze. In the reading section, what you need to do is just summarize, stay at the surface level. And if you did that in English class this past school year, you would probably not have done very well. Usually, if you just write an essay with summaries, your English teacher is going to tell you, okay, but what are your thoughts on it? Where's your analysis? We're taking that out of the equation. We're doing less than what your English teachers expect of you. But because you've been trained to think deeply, it's hard to unlearn that. Then for the science, yes, it's called science. It's not actually about science. It's still reading. It's just reading with a science theme. So instead of reading these long passages, now you're reading graphs, you're reading charts. There are some passages in there, but they're far shorter than what's in the reading. And then finally, you have the essay, which is technically optional. If you want to do super scoring, we do recommend that you take it one time, which will allow you to submit your super scores. Super scoring, by the way, is when you take the test on multiple sittings and the ACT will send only your highest scores to colleges. So let's say you take this upcoming June ACT and you do an amazing job in the English, you hit your goal score. The next test, you do an amazing job in the reading and science. And then finally, you do an amazing job in math. Colleges will only see those scores, the highest scores possible. But in order to do that, typically you have to do the essay. The essay does not impact your overall score. So there's no need to stress over it. Colleges are not really paying close attention to it unless you score like 1 or 2 points out of 12. Then it's a bit of a red flag. Okay. So now let's talk about timing for a sec. We have 45 minutes for those English questions, and there's 75 questions. So if you look at this versus this, that's a significant difference. We're used to seeing those numbers flipped. Because we have way more questions than we have time, strategy is especially important. It's important in general, but especially there. And in general, you'll see on the ACT that pacing is a little bit tighter, right? You have less time than, let's say, the SAT, but the questions are also more direct. So if you look at now the math, 60 minutes for 60 questions, that's also pretty steep, but you don't have to answer all 60 depending on your goal score. Like let's say you want to score a 25 in the math. Typically, if you answer the first like 40-ish questions, right, depending on the curve, you'll hit that. So you can basically not answer a third of the test and still land in like maybe around a 23, 24, potentially a 25. And we'll go over how to approach that in a little bit. And then reading and science, again, we have more questions than we have time. So we really need to get our strategy down and also figure out which questions are maybe not worth our time depending on our goal score. The only time you have to truly attempt every single question on this test is if you're aiming for a perfect score. Otherwise, you're attempting points you don't need. And then finally, you have the optional essay that is 40 minutes. In between, you're going to have these first two sections, English and math, then you'll get a 10-minute break. Then when you do reading and science, you get your 5-minute break before the optional essay. You do have to also select that essay when you register. It's not going to be given to you as an option on test day unless you add it. All right. Now let's talk about the scoring. When it comes to scoring, everything is scored from 1 to 36. Then it's just an average of those 4 sections. So let's say also that you feel really great about the English and you hit like a 32 or a 33. That means depending on your score, maybe your math can be a little bit lower because it's an average. And usually colleges they are curious about what you got in each section, but the composite is really what they're looking at, right? That's what they care the most about. So don't worry about, oh, I got a 33 in the English, but I only got like a 26 in the math. If the average hits your overall score or your overall goal, you're good. Okay. Now, a few quick tips. Accuracy over quantity. I kind of mentioned that before. You don't want to rush to answer all 60 math questions. Because when we rush to answer those 60, and the last 20 tend to be the most time consuming, the most effort consuming. When we're rushing to get to those last 20, we're going to make silly mistakes along the way. And then we may still not have enough time for those last questions. Think of it almost like if your goal score is below a 36, that means you don't have to answer every question. If you're answering every question, it's almost like if you're trying to get extra credit. And we can go over that in a little bit. Also, all the questions have the same point value. It's not like if you answer a more tricky question, you get more points. So there's no need to like do the tricky questions first, just because they give them to you first, and they do. Like in the reading section, they always start with, what's the main purpose of the whole passage? Okay, well, that's way more challenging than just what does this one word mean in the context? You're just looking at one sentence versus a whole passage. But if you start with that first question that asks you about the whole passage, now you're stressing for the remaining 9 questions, which you have way less time for. So what you want to do is develop your game plan. So I kind of referred to this just now, figuring out which questions are not worth your time, figuring out which questions give you a hard time. Now we're going to talk about something called letter of the day in just a bit, where you're going to pick one letter and one letter only and use it for any question that is not worth your time. You never leave a question blank. They don't take off points when you miss a question. And you never know. You might guess and it's the right answer. It's better to take that chance than to just kind of like leave the point there. Then the other thing, the ACT or the SAT is the second most important part of your college admissions, right? And it's even more important in terms of scholarship money. And I don't say that to pressure you. Look at this more as like an opportunity, especially when it comes to scholarship money. The way that I like to think of it is, okay, if I'm in high school, I could go get a job. The pay will not be great because I'm in high school. At the same time, I can look at this as a job. Not that I'm telling you to do this instead of a job. I know plenty of high school students have to juggle both. But when you practice for the ACT, it's almost like if you're clocking in for a shift. The more you practice, the more you're kind of gaining that way. The only thing is, unlike a job, you're not going to get a check every 2 weeks. You're going to get that check once you get to college. So think of this more of like, all right, this is an opportunity. This is a game. This is not a true test of what I know. It's about, can I outsmart them while they're trying to outsmart me? Okay. So I'm gonna check if we have questions. Oh, I see a question there. Okay. Let me just see. Okay. So can you only submit a super score with the writing portion? Can you submit just Yes, yes, it is. Also, never worry about asking a question. You don't have to apologize for asking questions. Literally what I'm here for. You do need the essay in order to super score. So if you're not going to super score, you don't need the essay. Like let's say you take the test and you get your goal score in that one sitting. Like let's say you take this June test, you got your goal score in that one June test, you're done. You don't have to take the essay. But if you want to super score and submit your best score from June, your best score from, let's say in the fall, you do need your writing portion, the essay portion, I should say. Also, by the way, not sure if you've already noticed this, but I am the least intimidating person ever. When I was a middle school teacher, I barely intimidated 10-year-olds. So literally any question you have, even if I did answer it, doesn't matter. I got your back. Okay. Any other questions? Right. Now, let's jump into that very first section. You get the English, where you get 45 minutes for 75 questions, which can feel so intimidating, right? Instead, think of this as, all right, I have 5 passages and I get 15 questions per passage. So almost think of it like you're working out. I have 5 sets, and in each set, I'm doing 15 reps. Now, in terms of what you will see, on average, about 14 of those 75 questions are punctuation based, which makes up the most of them compared to these other categories. Now, the categories that make up the other popular questions are more so main idea focused. You have to make sure that you understand what they're saying, how they say it. Punctuation is more so about the actual mechanics, the actual rules. It is content heavy. There's also other things that pop up, but just not as often. So, for example, prepositions, they're almost never on here. So you don't need to study prepositions. It's not worth your time. I know that especially juniors, you've probably had such a long year. Your time, your energy is precious. We do not want to waste it. All right. Now, the challenge, I kind of mentioned this before. It's probably been quite some time since you've studied grammar. There's a solid chance your teachers maybe didn't go over all the rules in depth. So that presents a bit of a challenge, but they test the same rules every time. So as long as you review those rules, you're in a strong place. So here are our strategies. Make sure you're reading the full sentence. They underline a portion, please don't stop where the underline stops. You have to read the entire sentence, read the answers. And here's what's really, really important. This is really like the test prep mindset that's getting built with this one right here. Find the differences in the answers. Going back to treating this like a game, try to look for patterns. For example, if you see that all the answers are changing the placement of a comma, now you know, okay, they're testing commas and commas only. Now I'm going to think of comma rules and nothing else. The other thing you're going to do is to eliminate rule breakers. Sometimes, a lot of the times, it's easier to spot what's wrong than to look for what's right. So if you're sitting there looking for what's right, and let's say you're stuck between two choices, I know that happens to a lot of students, what you can do is see what's wrong about one of them. Ah, good question. So what did I used to study when I took the ACT, SAT? How long did I study for? I'm gonna be honest with you. Um, I wasn't fully prepared. I didn't understand the way it worked. I think I did like a prep book, but it was not that great. Um, I think I may have gone to like a few tutoring, like a tutoring program for a group, but they never really got into the actual strategies, the ways to like avoid things. My recommendation for you in terms of studying, um, I would say work out of the ACT official questions if you can. I'm gonna double check before we end for today well, there's called the Big Red Book. Sorry. Let me get my words together. The Big Red Book comes directly from the ACT. You want to practice those official questions as much as you can, because then you'll get a solid sense. We also offer tutoring in terms of group courses. We have an on-demand course where you can watch videos and you do it on your own time. And then we also have one-on-one tutoring. Good question. All right. Oh, and one more thing before I forget about eliminating rule breakers. This is honestly kind of life advice. If you are looking for what's right and only what's right, you're gonna find it in the wrong places. Like think about maybe that friend who has a crush and the whole friend group is like, no, don't do it, don't do it. But that friend just keeps seeing the good in that person who they should not have a crush on. Same thing with these choices. If you're looking for the right aspect, then you're going to find it in the traps because the traps tend to be half right, half wrong. But if you're looking for what's wrong, you can get rid of things really quickly. Okay. Now, a few reminders. Answer choice A is always going to be no change. And I've heard from quite a few students that it feels weird to select that. They don't think it's the right answer. If it follows the rules, then it's the right answer. If the other choices are wrong, it's the right answer. Do not be afraid to pick it. There's never going to be two right answers. Only one is right. Sometimes you have to choose the best of the bad answer choices. Like in the English section in particular, the passages are not well written. Like some of the correct choices don't sound good, but they are grammatically correct. Along those lines, we only get to change the underlined portion. So when we look at the rest of the sentence and we're like, oh, that sounds so weird. I don't like that phrase. You're wasting your time because we can't change that phrase. Instead, whatever's not underlined, you're going to use it for clues. That's where we always find our clues anyways. Okay. Now, here's a strategy that we're going to practice called the vertical line test. And you're going to use this for punctuation questions because it's going to help you determine if you're working with complete or incomplete sentences. Punctuation is all about combining complete to complete or complete to incomplete. Like, for example, we only put a period between two complete thoughts. So if you see a period as an option, but we have complete to incomplete, we're not going to put a period there. Or if we have two complete thoughts and just a comma in between, we're not going to put a comma there either, right? You wouldn't end a sentence with a comma, you're ending it with a period. So here is something to keep in mind, and I'm going to do a little equation that I have as a trick. Two complete ideas can only be joined by a period, a semicolon, or a comma, and fanboys for and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Usually the ACT does comma and. So here's my little equation for you. If you see comma and, that is the same exact thing as a period, which is the same exact thing as a semicolon. So that package deal, it has to be both. It can't be the comma by itself. Comma plus and together does the same thing that a period does. So if you're going to end a sentence with a period and start a new one, you can also end that sentence with a comma and a fanboy. All right, now typically when you have incomplete ideas, you link them by using a comma. The comma by itself is just too weak to link complete thoughts, but it's great at linking the incomplete. So let's practice our vertical line strategy here. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to draw our vertical line where they're putting the all the punctuation. And I'm noticing they're putting the punctuation, or indeed they're not, after the word events. And I'm noticing that's what's changing too. They're changing it from either a comma versus a colon versus a semicolon versus no punctuation. So that means I have to keep all those rules in mind. And with our vertical line test, make that a little bit more clear. With our vertical line test, that's going to help me narrow things down. So I'm going to go ahead and read the first half before our vertical line. Ooh, hold on one sec. There we go. Actually, make sure you can see the no change. Okay, that's better. All right. A meteor shower captures the attention of any nighttime observer in a way that is unrivaled by other astrological events. Okay, what do we think? Complete or incomplete? You can either unmute yourself or you can send me a chat. And if you're not sure, it's okay. If you miss questions as we're going through, please don't stress. You need to miss them so that you can learn. As corny as it sounds, that's the only way you're going to know what to study. Okay, so I'm seeing complete. So the first half is complete. A meteor shower captures the attention of any nighttime observer in a way that is unrivaled by other astrological events. What makes it complete? It has our subject, a meteor shower. Captures is the verb, but subject verb is not enough to make it complete, right? Like if we end the sentence here, yes, we have a subject and a verb, but a meteor shower captures is not complete. It's complete when it comes back to the beginning or kind of like wraps up. So it tells us what it captures, so it's complete. Let's take a look at the second half though. They are deeply captivating due to their rare, unpredictable, and fleeting nature. Okay, what are we thinking, complete or incomplete? Okay. All right, so let me check, seeing complete here as well. Okay, so it goes from complete to complete. They, that's our subject. Are is our verb, deeply captivating due to their rare, unpredictable, and fleeting nature. So when we go from complete to complete, let's think about that equation I wrote before. We can do our comma with a fanboy. We could do a period. We could do a semicolon. The only option that gives us that is C. I also want to point out with answer choice B, they changed something. They dropped the word they. So with B, it goes into are deeply captivating due to their rare, unpredictable, fleeting nature. When you use a colon, it should have a very vague thought, and then it should expand on it with more details. Let me give you a quick example of that. Okay, so I can say the concert venue has a cool new feature. All right, vague. We don't know what that cool new feature is. Let's say the high quality projector, and we can end it there, right? It could be incomplete that way, but it can't start with the verb. It needs to just answer the question of, okay, what's the cool new feature? Right. Now, let me show you a different type of question. We're going to move away from punctuation and talk about transitions next. Oh, and also sometimes we do grammar super reviews where we actually go over every rule. So take a look at the Enhanced Prep website and see if that's coming up next. Make sure to register because then we jump into every single rule and how it's tested. All right, now transitions. These test the relationship between ideas, and they can be about ideas working together. Like it may say, um, therefore, similarly. It could be about them working against each other, like however, nevertheless. It can be a time reference, like next, finally. Or it could be cause and effect, like words like consequently literally sounds like consequence, right? Cause and effect. Your job is to understand how to link the ideas to each other. So let's practice our strategy for this. What we're going to do here is we are going to ignore what's there just for a moment. We don't want to read the transition and assume it's right. Instead, we're going to look at the sentence right before. We're going to summarize it. After that, we're going to read the sentence right after, summarize it, and then figure out what's the relationship between these two. Are they working together, against, cause and effect, or is this time related? All right, so I'm going to read the first half. The story describes how these 9 women aimed to support social justice in various ways. Okay, so in my summary, I'm seeing that the story is about these 9 women and they're focused on social justice work. By the way, when you're summarizing, don't worry about paraphrasing and like finding a synonym for every word. Stick to the language that they use because the ACT is very direct. And you'll see, especially in the reading, it's almost like if they copied and pasted the textual, the passage or part of the passage into the correct answer choice. So the closer you stick to the words they use, the more you set yourself up for success. So for the first one, 9 women, social justice, cool. Now, in the blue brackets, it says these women did not really meet to create a quilt together. Okay. So they didn't really meet, did not really meet. So the 9 women, they're working together in the green brackets in the first sentence, but then they're not actually meeting. So when I look at that, I'm like, it's not about timing. It's not cause and effect necessarily. They're not necessarily talking about the similar thing, right? Because they're saying they didn't really meet. So what I'm seeing is that there is contrast, or they're somewhat working against. The other thing I want to point out to you, and this is part of developing a test prep mindset, if we look at our answer choices, B, C, and D, or I'm sorry, B and C are doing something very similar. In other words, also, you're adding on or you're summarizing, but we're not summarizing, so B is out. There's no summary. We're not giving an additional point that's similar, so C is out. It's not, and also these women did not really meet. So now we have in actuality versus on the other hand. Both give contrast. But when we say on the other hand, we're talking about like the opposing condition. So we can say there are a lot of tricky questions on the ACT or hold on, let me actually give you a better one. I can take a practice test every single day. On the other hand, I could be more strategic and make sure I don't burn out, right? So it's more like 2 opposing options. We don't have that type of opposition. So for that reason, D is out and we have to go with A because it's saying, hey, actually, in actuality, they didn't really meet. They did work together, but they didn't actually meet. So that's a transition question. Next up, we're going to take a look at a words in context question where you have to recognize and maintain the tone. And context is everything. Really zoom into those clues. And whatever, like I mentioned before, whatever's not underlined tells us so much. And it's not necessarily testing your knowledge of definitions. They love to pick words that have like 3 or 4 definitions. And usually the definition that we are most familiar with tends to lead us to a trap. So what we really, really need to do is understand the context. And we need to prioritize concise writing. Concise means you're using less words. And from an English teacher perspective, that is a sign of strong writing. You want every word to serve a purpose. You don't want to have ideas repeated or be redundant. So kind of think about a teacher who explains things with very long sentences and just talks for a long, long, long time. Then think of a teacher who gives you quick, short explanations. Who are you paying more attention to? Who are you going to get more information from? Same thing with your writing. Longer writing does not mean better. The other side of that too, by the way, when you see short sentences on the ACT, don't assume that they're incomplete. I've seen a sentence as short as, I think, 4 or 5 words on the ACT. Just because it's short does not mean it's incomplete. Just because it's simple or vague does not mean it's incomplete. But when you use less words or when you're more intentional about the words you use, your message is, you're able to deliver that message more effectively. And then going back to what we mentioned before, process of elimination. We want to make sure that we're looking for what's wrong and taking it out, throwing out the trash. Now let's practice with this words in context question. The question asks which choice most clearly indicates that the squid uses substantial force when fending off a predator in this way. So we have to really, really look at adjectives when it comes to questions like this. Whatever we pick, it needs to be substantial. So I'm going to zoom into the sentence that the underlined portion is part of. In order to distract a predator in the heat of the moment, this squid wrenches off the writhing tips of its arms and flings them in the wake of its escape. Okay, so substantial. Let's think about that. That means intense. It means a lot, a lot. When I hear wrenches, I'm like, all right, that sounds pretty intense. Breaks, not quite doing the job. Pulls is also a little weak. Tears, also not as intense, not as substantial as wrenches. And notice B, C, and D, they all have that in common. Wrenches, it just has a different vibe to it, right? And whenever you see an answer choice, typically, when you see an answer choice that's doing something very different from the rest, solid chance that's the right answer. Okay. I've been throwing a lot of information your way. Please, please feel free to continue asking those questions. Okay. So we're going to go ahead on to pronouns next. We have examples of them all right here. So you always want to make sure you find the noun that it's referring to and make a match. So let me show you what that looks like. Oh, and also, before we jump into reading this sentence, something I want to point out. Answer choice B, literally not a thing ever. That word does not even exist. It's not a thing. So whenever you see ITS apostrophe, don't even consider it, get rid of it. Whenever you see IT apostrophe S, you need to read that as it is, because if you read what's underlined, no change, it sounds the same as C, which gets us nowhere. But if I read it with it is, listen to how it sounds. While one part is sewn into the gown's topmost portion, the other is sewn into it is lowermost portion. That didn't work. So we're going to take that out. No change does not work for us. So now it's versus there. We're dealing with singular versus plural. Let's figure out what that pronoun is even referring to. What is the lowermost portion? Okay, well, the lowermost portion has to refer to the gown. And it's just one gown. It's singular. So that means we're going to go with answer choice C. It's sewn into its lowermost portion. Okay, we may skip a few writing just to make sure we get to all of the other sections. I'm going to skip verbs for now. Let's talk about concise. I mentioned before, we want to be intentional with our words. The shortest answer on this test tends to be best. So what you're going to do strategy-wise, look for words you can eliminate without changing the context or meaning. And if there's punctuation or a conjunction, check for words that mean the same on both sides. So they may say daily in the first half of the sentence, and then they'll say every day in the second half. Well, we already said daily, so we don't need to say every day. Then something else is they love to give you the delete answer. Just check very carefully if you're going to pick that. Just double check that it works. And then check for consistency when it comes to a list. When we have a list, every item in that list should have the same structure. So if we're talking about a list of cities, every item needs to be a city. It can't just be like city, state, city, country. Everything needs to be the same. If we have a list of, let's say we're describing different types of animals, right? Like fluffy dog. Let's see, nosy cat. That means the third item also has to start with an adjective and then have a noun right after. So let's take a look here. And one way that you'll know it's a concise question is because, well, first of all, there's no punctuation, there's no transition. All these answer choices communicate the same idea, but they use different amounts of words to get there. Right away, there's an answer choice that's doing something very, very different. Crowd. So that should kind of catch your attention. Oh, G is most likely right. It is. Let me go over why. So this little paragraph says, steam rose in plumes from the rust-colored sulfuric pool, creating what looked like the surface of an entirely different planet. It felt odd to witness such alien beauty while listening to the tourist chatter of the collective group that had gathered. Okay, well, a group is already collective. And if it's a group, they already gathered. So we don't need to say all of that, right? So I'm going to take out this. We don't need to do all that. Group of about 50 people. We don't need to get specific. The only time you need to get specific like that is if they ask you for it. And they do occasionally. They'll ask you, what's the most specific option? Sure, then we need a number. But if it's a group, we don't need to mention how many people are in it. So H is going to be out for that reason. And then J, people who stood together by the pool's edge. Well, they already mentioned that they're at the pool. So we don't need to say that all over again. We already established that location, so we're not going to do it again. Now, we already said what's wrong with no change. So as I mentioned before, crowd is the right answer. We don't need to expand beyond that. We're good as is. The less words we use, the more clear the idea is. Okay. Then a few other things to just double check. When you see the word being is used for passive voice. So be careful. Typically, that's not the right answer because the ACT does not like passive voice. In general, writing is considered to be stronger when it's active because it's usually more direct that way. When you see contractions like IT apostrophe S, just make sure you're taking them apart and reading them the way that I did when I said it is. Look out for those delete options. Double check that the sentence is still complete once we delete it. Make sure we're not losing anything super important if we do delete it. And sometimes the delete option is right. And then if, let's say the question is really long, imagine that you have to figure out where a paragraph belongs. So now you have to read all these other paragraphs. Not worth your time. Letter of the day, which again means you pick one letter and one letter only, and you use that for every question that is not worth your time. And it's not so much that you can't handle that question. It's more like you don't need it. It's going to be a waste of your time and effort. And like I said, both of those are precious. Okay. So I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit so that we can jump into our other section. Just going to show you what it looks like in terms of an actual passage and what you would want a letter of the day. So you see where we have to figure out which sentence 2 goes. We have to consider all these other sentences, letter of the day. Depending on 39, it depends on honestly your practice. It'll tell you a lot in terms of the types of questions that do take more time for you. 39 might take a bit, especially in comparison to say 33. 33 is going to be way quicker than 39. 38 is going to be even quicker than that. Remember I mentioned before, specific, right? That's when we get into actual numbers. So be mindful of the amount of time and effort that a question will take, and know that there's a certain amount, depending on your goal score, that you don't need to answer. And usually if you look up like ACT raw score, you'll get a good idea of that, and you can play around with the numbers that way. So just Google ACT raw score, and usually it'll give you a solid idea of how many questions you need to answer correctly in order to hit a certain score. Okay, just a quick recap here. Punctuation question, we use our vertical line test wherever they put the punctuation. All right, so I'm just going to skip ahead, make sure we can get to our other sections. If we have some more time, we can jump back into it. So let's talk about the ACT math next. And honestly, like this entire test, accuracy is so much more important than speed, but because the pacing is tricky, a lot of students want to rush naturally, right? If you know you don't have a lot of time, you're typically not going to be like, do, 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 do. You're going to want to move quick, and that's where the mistakes happen. So the other thing to keep in mind is that, like I said, this math is different. She's built different from your high school math. They ask it in a different way. So you may know a concept. They're going to try to make it feel unfamiliar. Your job is to make it feel familiar again. And then you're going to want to use the answers. You don't always have to start from scratch. You can work backwards. And then you're also going to use logic elimination. You're going to estimate. You don't have to always do every single step. I think what's challenging is that, I know definitely when I was in high school, if you didn't show every single step, your math teacher was done with you, done. That's not okay, right? Over here, no one is looking at your steps. The ACT does not care about that. They're just trying to trick you. They don't care what steps you take. So let's say you're doing some steps. you're getting close to the last answer or to your final answer, you look at the answer choice and you're like, oh, actually, there's only one option that it could possibly be, because this would have to be like a negative number. And I have four positive choices and only one negative. You don't have to actually solve for that specific number. Okay. Now, here's the thing. The last 20-ish questions are the most time consuming, the most effort consuming. Historically, about 8% of the country will correctly answer those last few questions, especially like from 50 through 60. So depending on your goal score, you most likely don't even need them. You would only need to tackle those if you're aiming for like high 30s. If you're aiming for mid 20s, nah, don't even stress those. Letter of the day, one letter only. Don't go A, B, C, D, C, B, A. When you do that, statistically, you're not setting yourself up for success. When you pick one letter, like let's say you pick C and do 41 through 60 is all C, you're more likely to get more points. All right, so now let's take a look at how the ACT tests math. We're going to jump into this question here about a rectangle. And by the way, whenever they mention a shape, but they don't draw it, please don't try to imagine it up here. Keep in mind that by the time you hit the math section, you will have already completed 75 English questions, and it's only like 9 a.m. on a Saturday. So we want to make sure we're setting our brains up for success, draw things out, write things out. Mental math, we don't know her during the official. So let me draw this rectangle for us. Rectangle A, B, C, D. We have a perimeter of 60 inches. So the other part of the math strategy, and this actually correlates to the English strategy, you want to always start by thinking about what is being tested. So just like before we thought, okay, oh, they're testing if I know commas versus semicolons. Now they're testing if we know perimeter. So perimeter is adding everything up. So once we add up all these sides, they will equal 60, okay? Now the next bit of information, notice I'm taking it one bite at a time. If we try to process the whole thing in one shot, it tends to be more of a hot mess. So now let's take a look at the next bit of information. The width of a rectangle is 8 inches shorter than the length. Okay, now we have to look for the length. And we could approach it algebraically. Sure, we can do x for the length and x minus 8 for the width. But we can also work backwards and look at these answer choices. And when we work backwards, we're going to want to start in the middle always. So let's say that the length is 19. Okay. Well, if I were to add those up, I'm going to get 38. 60 minus 38 gives me 22. So that means these two sides here are both going to be 11, right? Because that gives me 22 plus 38 gives me 60. So we know that rectangles have those two congruent sides. So if we look at the difference between those two, the width is 8 inches shorter than the length. We're done. We don't even have to try anything else. I'm not gonna lie to you, it doesn't always work out that easily. If H doesn't work though, you have typically a solid idea of if you need to go lower to J and K or if you want to go up to F and G, because they always arrange these answer choices from the smallest to the greatest value. Okay, so let's take a look at this one next, and we're going to practice kind of taking a step back, trying to look for some patterns and estimate some things. So this says Amelia drew a circle graph to represent how he spent each evening during her winter break. Her homeroom teacher said that the number of days listed is correct, but that the central angle measures for the sectors were not correct. What should be the central angle measure for the board game night sector? That was a lot of information. So we're going to take it apart just one bite at a time. So the number of days listed is correct. Central angle measures are not correct. Okay, so looking at the central angle measure for the board game night sector. Well, if we look at board games, they tell us that 4 days were spent on board games, and the days are accurate, right? That's what they mentioned before. Days are accurate. Cool. Now let's take a look at how many days there are in total. We have 4 plus 1 plus 1 plus 3. So that gives us 9 days. So 4 over 9 days should be equivalent to x over 360 degrees, because if we're thinking about the total number of days, it's 9, and 4 is just one part of that. If we're thinking about the total number of degrees, it's 360. So we need to figure out what portion of the 360 makes up the same ratio as 4 to 9, or 4 over 9. When you have a fraction that's equal to another fraction, what you're going to do every single time is you're going to cross multiply. So in other words, we're going to do 4 times 360, which will give us 1,440. By the way, please take advantage of that calculator. We're not doing mental math. There's no need. And this is going to be equal to 9x. And then to get x, we're just going to divide 1440 by 9. And we get that x is equal to 160. We are done. And I'm going to be honest with you, probably the first time I saw a question like this, even I was like, what did I just read? And notice how with the previous question, when I read it one sentence at a time, it felt a little bit more smooth. So you can feel it out. Some students need to read the whole thing, like they don't like stopping. They feel like it interrupts them. That's okay. Just make sure you go back and digest it one bite of information at a time. Okay. Let's go ahead on to another one. So this one says Juliet received a $150 gift card to Sephora for her birthday. Okay, Juliet, you got spoiled. She plans to buy her favorite brand of eyeliner, foundation, and blush that costs $15, $30, and $25 respectively. If she purchases 2 sets of foundation and 1 set of blush, what is the maximum number of eyeliners she can purchase? Okay, so let's take it back to one bite of information at a time. We have a total of 150. Okay, great. From here, let's check one quick thing. Okay, from here, we know that whatever she spends, it's going to equal 150. Okay, now let's start off with the sets of foundation. The foundation is going to be $30 because foundation is the second item. Let me color code this better. Foundation is the second item in that list. $30 is also the second item in that list. All right, so she purchases 2 sets of foundation. Oh, my brain skipped ahead. So we have $60 spent there. Cool. And she purchases 1 set of blush. The blush is going to be the last one. Hold on one sec. Let me color coordinate that too. Okay, so blush. Oh, there it is. Blush is $25. Cool. All right, so 25. Now we need to figure out how many sets of eyeliners, or how many eyeliners she can purchase. So for that, we can represent it as, okay, we don't know how many, right? That's X. Whenever we don't know what something is, we're going to stick an X on that. And we know that each eyeliner costs $15. So it's going to be 15x. That's the algebraic approach. You would just go ahead, combine your like terms, or distribute that, combine like terms, subtract, divide, get x by itself. Or you can also work backwards and use the answer choices. So we know that just between the foundation and the blush, that costs $60 plus 25. So she already spent $85 just on foundation and blush. Girl, I feel that. They really do be like that. Okay, so $85 just on those 2. Then we need to figure out how much more she's going to spend on eyeliner in order to hit that 150, right? Because they're asking for maximum number. What is the most she could buy? Also sounds like me when I'm shopping. Okay, so if we work backwards, starting always in the middle, always. Let's say she purchases 5 eyeliners, okay? Well, each eyeliner is, let me color coordinate that for us as well. Eyeliner is 15. Okay, so if she purchases 5 eyeliners, 15 times 5, that's 75 plus 85, 160. That's too high. So we're not going to check these other ones. We're going to look at G. Okay, so now we're gonna get, oh, hold on one sec. Make sure I got the math right. We have two sets of foundation for 30. We have one set of blush for 25. Oh, maximum number, yes. So if we put in answer choice G, what we're going to get is $145, which is the most she can spend, right? Because if she gets another eyeliner, it's going to go over that budget. So we're going to have to go with G. We don't even need to check F. We're done. All right, let's keep going. Now, going back to what I mentioned before about always identifying what's being tested. You want to do that because it's going to help you get started. And a lot of times with the math, I notice that students struggle the most when they don't know where to start, and that is not a great feeling. So by identifying what's being tested, you at least get started. So with 19, it says the mean age of the 4 students in the class is 26 years old. All right, let's stop there for a second. Because they said mean, they're testing mean or average. So right away, the first thing I'm gonna do is write down the average formula, which is average equals sum divided by the number of values. Okay, so now we can start plugging some stuff in. They tell us that there's 4 students that would align with our 4 values. They tell us the average is 26. I'm going to plug that into where it says average. And now we can find the sum by cross multiplying. If we do 26 times 4, we're going to get 104. What the ACT likes to do is they're giving you information sometimes indirectly, and you just have to connect the dots. They didn't come out and say the sum is 104, but they gave you enough information to figure it out. And it's your job to connect those dots. If we don't write that formula though, it's so much harder to do that. Okay, looking at the next bit of information, one of the 4 students whose age is 32 leaves the class. Well, if that student whose age is 32 leaves the class, we can't include their age anymore in our sum. So we're going to do 104 minus 32. We get 72. And now the question is asking, what is the new mean age of the remaining 3 students? So we have to use that formula again one more time. So plugging it in, we don't know the average. We have to solve for it. Let me write that over here. So we're solving for the average. We know the new sum is 72. We know that there are now 3 students remaining in the class. 72 divided by 3, we get 24. But notice how much tougher this would have been if we never started with writing down the actual question. Okay, so now let's take a look at a few more, and then we'll switch off into reading and science. I want to make sure we hit every section. Okay, just check one quick thing. Okay, so for the next few ones, we'll just go over the general method relatively briefly. If we have some more time, we'll jump back to it. So first of all, using that strategy again of identifying what's being tested, they say functions. So, okay, I have to think about the way that functions work. Now they ask us, what is the value of h of g of -2? So when you see these functions back to back like that, your first step is going to be to do g of -2. Like ignore the h, pretend it doesn't exist for a second. You're going to plug that in and make sure you're using parentheses when you do that. Really important. -2. So then we're going to get our answer for g of -2. So 4 minus 2. And now what they're really asking you, I wrote way too big. If we bring that h back, what it's really asking you for is h of 2. And that's far more simple. Sometimes they also bring in distracting information. It doesn't happen that often, but in this case, f of x is irrelevant. Okay, jumping into geometry. Keep in mind, again, this does not come up nearly as much as the algebra. So in your studies, focus on algebra the most. Make sure that your algebra is super solid, algebra 1 and 2, before you look at geometry. Because if you spend too much time on things like geometry and trig, they only make up a small part of the test. You need to be able to be solid on the majority of it. And also, geometry incorporates algebra. They build on each other. Well, geometry builds on algebra that way. So if your algebra needs work, your geometry is going to be a struggle. And I don't want you to struggle. All right, so looking at number 18, it says a rectangle has two identical circles circumscribed in a rectangle. What is the area of the rectangle in square inches if the radius of one of the circles is 8? Okay, so let's think about what's being tested. We need to know the area of the rectangle, sure. We also need to know what a radius is. So keeping that in mind, what they give us now, the way they draw that radius, we can't do much in terms of figuring out how it relates to the rectangle sides. But here's something that we can figure out. Anytime you go from the center of the circle to the edge, and it does not matter what direction you go in. So like, let's say we go this way and then this way. We know it's going to be 8 here and 8 here. So now we know the width is 16. I can apply that same logic, and instead of going vertically, I can go horizontally. So I can go like this. All right, we're going to go from the center to the edge. That's our radius. That's 8. We do that again, that's 8. We do that again, that's another 8. One more time, another 8. So if we look at the length, that's going to give us 32. And now we take it back to the other thing that's being tested, which is area of the rectangle, length times width. Unlike the SAT, they don't provide you any formulas. So it is important that you memorize some, especially areas of typical shapes like circle, triangle, rectangle, guaranteed to come up squares. Okay, so now plugging in our length and width, here's what we get. We're going to do 32. Oh, wait a minute. Hold on one sec. Oh, yeah, 32 times 16. And once we do that, we are going to get 512. I noticed with H and J, they included pi, hoping that you mix something up and look for the area of a circle instead of area of a rectangle, but they didn't get us. We zoomed in on area of the rectangle. And when you're taking the test, by the way, make sure that you are marking things up, circle them, underline them, especially when you get to the question, because it's very easy that as you're doing the steps, especially if there's a lot of steps, you may have forgotten specifically what's being asked. The other thing that ACT likes to do is it will ask you for like 5x plus 10. And then you solve for x, they're going to have x as answer choice A typically. You need to make sure that you go back to the question and you finish all the way through. Okay, let's skip this one for now, just to make sure we get to all of the reading and the science. So some math strategies. You want to really get a clear grasp of the question. So ask yourself, okay, wait, what are they asking me? What are they testing? Where are they going with this? And this is why it's important to identify what's being tested. Actually, let me write that down really quick. Great. All right. So then you're going to write down necessary information. Like I said, we're not doing any mental math. We're setting ourselves up for success by keeping our thoughts on the paper. We're also going to use process of elimination. Usually one or two are going to be obviously wrong. And you can also make educated guesses, especially if you're a bit stuck. You can kind of guesstimate a little bit. And we're going to try to avoid calculating if we can, because some questions want answers in another format. And for example, what I've seen a lot is if the answer choice has pi as part of the answer, don't type pi into your calculator, because then your final answer is not going to have the pi symbol. It's going to multiply by 3.14, blah, blah, blah. We don't want that. So if we can avoid doing a certain step, we're going to do it. And my work as a test prep tutor is the complete opposite of my work as a classroom teacher, where I want my students to give their all, right? Put in the work, do all the steps. On this test, I want you doing the least, not the most. We want to get there the simplest way possible. We want to avoid overthinking. Okay. So let's get into the reading next. Speaking of, by the way, as an English teacher, this section in particular really bugs me because it really is the opposite of what you're supposed to do in English class. So you're going to get these four passages, 10 questions each, 35 minutes total. So you're looking at just under 9 minutes per passage. What they ask the most common question type is detail slash line reference, which is good. That is a very good thing because those questions tell you where to go. And if they don't tell you the line, they'll mention a detail that you can use to search for the evidence. So by the way, when a question says a certain word, that means you have to look for that specific word in the passage. Now, a few other common question types, author's purpose, where they're asking about more like big picture ideas, not just little details. Same thing with main idea, that's more big picture. Some of the things that almost never come up, literary devices. Think about like personification, metaphors, analogies. You don't need to study all of that because it barely comes up. On average, there's less than 2 questions per test that include literary devices. And going back to being strategic with your precious time and energy, we are not answering questions that we don't need the points of. Okay. Oh, I see we have a few new people joining. Please feel free to use that chat to ask me any questions at all, and these annotated notes will be sent out. All right, let's keep going. Up next, let's talk about the different kinds of passages. It will always start with the literary narrative, aka fiction. That always comes first. But typically, the fiction tends to be the one that students have the lowest accuracy on. The reason I think that is because fiction is what you read the most in the classroom. And when you read fiction, your teacher pushes you to really think deeply, make text to world connections, analyze. So students really fall into that naturally in the fiction. We cannot make text to world connections. If the ACT tells us the sky is green, the sky is green. If it tells us that dogs meow, then they meow. We know nothing. We assume nothing. Because when we assume, when we think deeper, we fall for their traps. Okay. Now, the next few, you'll see social sciences, you'll see humanities, and usually it ends in natural sciences. What you want to do is, because fiction tends to have lower accuracy statistically, don't start with that. Typically, I have had students who just loved to follow a story. They did really well with the fiction. Whatever passage you feel great about, that's where you need to start. Whatever passage is going to help get you confidence, whichever passage is going to take the least effort, that's where you start. Kind of like the way that you do a workout. You're going to start with lighter weights and then work your way up, typically, not the other way around. Because if you start off real heavy, you may risk some injury, right? Same thing here. I don't want you to feel any pain. Now, there's also a dual passage. Typically, the dual is either in the social science or the humanities, but I've seen it in the fiction and I've seen it in the natural science. For the dual passage, because you're juggling 2 perspectives, you want to do this one second to last, usually. Oh, make sure you can see that, second to last. And then fiction, this one should be first. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. First, if you really enjoy it. Last, if you do not. And again, practice will definitely tell you more about that. Then when it comes to social science and humanities, see which one you enjoy reading more. You want to start with the passage that just feels the most comfortable to you. If you enjoy science, maybe start with natural science. If all of the details and scientific language throws you off, don't start there. I think the most important thing is just to make sure that you're leaving the trickier passages for you last. Okay. So these passages, they're boring and they're long typically. And the questions are tricky on purpose. So the trick here is you want to approach it like an open book test. I've had a lot of students read it and then try to use their memory to find the right choice. Why? You're stressing yourself out for in an unnecessary way. There's already enough stress, right? High school is already stressful enough. You don't need to do all that. All the answers are in the text. Also, this is the third section. By the time you hit reading, you already did 75 English questions, 60 math questions. So between the 75 English, 60 math, our brain, it might be struggling just a little bit, right? Endurance-wise. So why rely on your memory when you can just turn the page and see the answer right there? Not to mention that the correct answer is usually almost verbatim to the text. Like, let's say the text says, the dog weighs 10 pounds. The correct answer will say, the dog weighs 10 pounds. It's going to be the same exact phrase typically. So if you're relying on your memory and you misremember, you're giving yourself a harder time than you need to. Along those lines, don't paraphrase too much. Try to stick to the text, like use the same language. You're not submitting a summary to your teacher. You're just summarizing it for yourself. So don't paraphrase with a bunch of synonyms, because what if your synonym is not exactly the same as the text? Now, as you're reading, you want to spend about 2 to 3 minutes. And you might be like, Olga, how? That sounds like, how can I read all that in 2 to 3 minutes? Well, you're not reading it to deeply understand it. You're reading it just to familiarize yourself with it. And as you read, you're going to make notes, you're going to underline, you're going to circle stuff that came up in the question. So we look at the questions first, you see what they ask about, and then as you're reading, you're going to underline and circle whatever's related to them. You're also going to identify main ideas and purposes. You don't have to put that in the margins. It's not annotations the way that you do in school. If you do any annotations here, it should be minimal, super quick, super light, just to kind of help shine a spotlight on where your evidence is going to be. That is all. And finally, the points are in the questions. So please do not rush when you read that question. Something else I've noticed with a lot of students is that they'll read a question, they'll look for the evidence. Then when they're looking for the answer choices, they kind of forget what the question was asking. So please make sure you always keep that question in mind, mark it up, right? That's the beauty of this being a paper format, typically, unless your school, it's a school day test and they opt for the digital. Okay, so let me show you what this looks like in terms of our reading process. I mentioned before, we don't have to start with the first passage just because they give it to us first. You start with the passage that you enjoy the most. I mean, you may not enjoy any of them. Let me say the passage that causes you the least pain, the passage that takes the least effort, so that you are not drained and you have enough energy for the other three. You're going to read and reorder the questions. The reason you want to do that is because when you read the questions, first of all, you have a solid idea of what to actually pay attention to when you read the passage. And then, like I said before, just because they give us question number one as number one doesn't mean we have to do it first. And usually, because they're petty, they give you the first question about the entire passage. And then the last or second to last question may be about just one word. Looking at one word or one sentence is way less work than looking at the whole passage. So we're going to start with the questions that require less time and effort, which means the questions that tell us exactly where to go. We want to do those first. When you work the passage, what we mean by that is you are going to mark it up. Oh, let me switch that really quick. Do not just read it without marking anything up because you're going to zone out. It's guaranteed. These are boring. These are really boring. And your brain's going to be a bit tired. So keep that pencil active to prevent that, to prevent yourself from kind of zoning out. And when you mark it up, be strategic. Don't mark things up because you think it's important. Mark it up if the questions ask about it. And this goes against everything I believe as an English teacher and what I do in the classroom. But on this test, this is not about like your true reading skills. It's more of a game. It's more of like the question asks about a certain word. You look for that word in the passage. Whatever idea is there, you match it back to the answer choice. So with that being said, if, oh, let me make that a bit bigger so it's easier for you all to see. So if the questions don't ask about it, we don't care about it. We're not going to underline it because if you underline stuff that they didn't ask about, it's going to be so much tougher to find the evidence. Okay, so really important. Now, find your window and mark it. That means when you read that question, you're going to go back to the text. You're not relying on your memory, and you can write the number of the question next to it. And here is one of the most important steps. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of students have a hard time with this one because you're used to reading a question, answering it right away, not a lot of things going on in between. But you have to speak for yourself. You have to basically summarize what you read to yourself. So you can tell yourself, okay, this is what I'm going to look for in the right choice. If you don't do that, you're more likely to fall for traps because now they're guiding your thinking, not the other way around. If you know roughly what to look for, you don't have to have this exact answer ready to go, but if you know what the correct answer should have, you can get rid of all the traps. The other thing to consider is that it's kind of like if you've ever gone holiday shopping and you don't know what to get somebody. You walk into the store, the salesperson shows you a whole bunch of stuff, takes you all over the store. You finally get something and you're like, I guess this is it. I don't know. I spent too much time. I'm tired, whatever. This is going to work. Versus you walk into the store and you're like, oh, I don't know exactly what to get, but I know that my aunt loves lavender. So I'm only going to look for stuff with lavender. So now you're going to save yourself some time and energy. And then finally, process of elimination. Take out the trash. Look for what is wrong because that is way easier to spot. When you look for what is right, they have traps that are half right. So if you only look for what's right, you're going to fall for traps. Look for what's wrong. Throw out the trash. Okay. So let's go over each of these steps briefly. So literary narrative, they always give that to us first. If I've been practicing ACT stuff and I really enjoy fiction, my accuracy is high, it doesn't drain me, I may start with it first. But in general, our recommendation is that you leave this for last because typically accuracy is lower on that one. Now, taking a look at passage 2, it's a dual passage because it says passage A and passage B. Well, I don't want to do that first. As a matter of fact, I want to save this for the second to last. So there we go, second to last. Perfect. Okay. Then the humanities passage. This one says it's adapted from the article Phone Home, the Cultural Impact of Spielberg. Okay, that sounds interesting. Natural science, the passage is adapted from the article Putting the Rad in Radical. So it's up to you. Like for me, I lean a little bit more towards humanities. So for me, I would probably do passage 3 first, passage 4 second. For me, if you look at the humanities passage, you're like, oh, this looks boring. Don't start there. So for me, I'm gonna say first because I like humanities, and then I'm gonna say this for second. So that means this would be third. And then finally, fiction for last. All right, so we reordered the passages. Now it's time to reorder the questions. And you don't have to get like an exact order down. More so, what's more important is you figure out what you're tackling first. So briefly scanning, I noticed that a few questions tell me exactly where to go. That means I want to start with those 3 for sure. The one that I especially want to start with first is number 30. Oh, let me try that again. Number 39. This one is great because I just have to look at one sentence and think about this word within that context. By the way, they don't actually care about the definition. Like your knowledge of that definition, throw it out the window. It doesn't matter. Not that it doesn't matter, but what matters most is the context, the way that word is used in relationship to the rest of the sentence. So when you're going back to line 43, you have to ignore that word. Pay attention to the clues around it instead. Now, something that's going to take more time, looking at 31, reasonably be inferred. As soon as you see that, it's not going to be as direct of a match between the text and the answer choice. It's every single correct answer is still heavily grounded in the text. Every single correct answer has strong textual support. But when it says reasonably be inferred, it's not going to be as obvious. So I'm going to leave that for later. Something else that I'll probably leave for later is number 40. Well, 40 is already last. But when they say except, It's easy to miss that even if it's in all caps. So we want to avoid because typically that one tends to be a tad trickier. Okay. So now actually reading this, when we're going through it, we're going to mark up what came up in the questions. And this can be underlining, circling. They don't allow you to bring highlighters. So just to kind of show you an example of what we're referring to. I see that atoms comes up quite a few times. So I have to look out for his name. Radicals is coming up. So I got to look out for radicals, something about reactive, photodissociation. And don't worry about memorizing a whole bunch of these terms. Just a few will do. Because remember, you're going to go back to the passage anyways. And a few other tips in terms of what to typically underline or circle. Here is what typically comes up in the questions. Put what to circle. So definitely lead words. So basically the words from the questions. And when I say lead words, it has to be more of like a word that you would find in the passage. It can't be like according to, based on, that doesn't count. Or like important to, words like that don't really count as much. And then after the lead words, you also want to look out for proper nouns. So people, places, things. Typically those come up in questions. Quotes, italics, parentheses. And then for people who have joined after the start of the session, all of these notes will be sent out, and including my annotations. So italics, parentheses, what's in between dashes, numbers. And then whenever they use contrasting words like but, yet, however, notice that when they use the word but, yet, however, usually there's a question associated with that, because when we use the word but, yet, however, an idea shifted. There's a contrast, and the ACT loves to see if you caught on to that shift. I see a question. Oh, sure, no problem. Okay, so let's keep going. All right, so an example here. I see atoms, which came up in the question. Here's our proper noun. I see a quote, which is important for us. So I'm reading through, I'm underlining as I go. Oh, radicals, that came up. And again, just to reiterate, it's not about what I think is important. There are several sentences where I'll read and I'm like, oh, that sounds like it's meaningful. But if the questions don't ask about it, we don't care about it. Oh, photo dissociation, things like that. So you're marking things up as you read, marking it up as you read, keep going, keep going. And then you can go tackle those questions after you finish reading. I have had some students answer questions while they're reading. It's up to you. I would definitely practice both ways first to see which one works best for you. Don't like try out something new on the official. Try that out before you get there. By the way, I'm curious, how many of you are going to be taking the June 8th ACT? If you can please send a chat. Thanks. All right, I gotcha. Sounds good. So you still have some time, right? We got about a little bit over a week. You can practice that now and figure out what you like better. Stacy too. All right. Yeah, quite a few targeting for August. Sounds good. Oh yeah. So you have time for that too. And keep in mind, I think the majority of the people in this room are juniors. They have testing throughout the fall. Usually throughout the fall, you have at least 2 chances, if not 3. If you include August, you may be looking at 4 chances. And with super scoring in mind, you don't have to get that goal score in one sitting. So let's say for this upcoming June test, whichever sections you feel the strongest in, study those. Like really, really focus on those for the next week, because in about a week's time, it's going to be tough to lock in all 4 if you haven't been practicing. But if you really zoom into 1 or 2 sections, you could really lock them down for this June test. Gotcha. Oh, and we got some sophomores in here too. Excellent. Good. So yeah, you have time. Don't worry about that composite goal score in one shot. The only time you do need to make sure you hit that goal score in one sitting is if you apply to a school that does not accept super scores. Like the University of Texas, for example, will not accept super scores, so that's not an option. So before you take that super score route as an option, check with the schools you have in mind. the majority do accept. It's only a handful that don't. Okay, so looking at 39, it says, as it is used in line 43, the word surmount most nearly means, okay, we don't care about the word surmount. They don't care about the word surmount. They care about the context clues. So we're going to take a look. Where does this start? 39, it's going to be right here. So I'm going to read that sentence. And as a matter of fact, oh, whoa, I'm sorry. It's line 43. It's question 39. Okay, 41, 2, 3. Okay, so here it is. What I recommend is crossing out surmount in the passage. Otherwise, your brain is going to keep thinking of the definition that we're most familiar with, and usually that's a trap. They do that on purpose. So this says, this method also imparts the radicals with additional energy that can be used to blank any energetic barriers to reacting, okay? So looking at our clues, it's saying something about this method does something that's additional. So something is added and it can be used. Okay. So to me, that sounds pretty positive, right? You add something, it can be used to do something. So considering that it's doing something to energetic barriers, I'm going to guess a few words. So maybe, I'm trying not to guess the words that are there. By the way, do your best to ignore those answer choices. We really want to think for ourselves first. So maybe to, hmm, hmm. Actually, I'm curious, what would you put instead of surmounts? I'll give you all just a few seconds. Mm. So, you know what I'm thinking? Maybe if an exact word isn't coming to mind, we can just say something like get over or like push through any barriers. Okay, the most important thing is that whatever we choose, we're doing that to barriers. It really helps if you zoom in to the word right after what's underlined or what they're asking about, I should say. So now looking at our options, we're not avoiding barriers. That doesn't match. Vanquishing a barrier, it's a little bit dramatic. We don't really vanquish barriers, so that's going to be out. And then we don't really defeat a barrier. We more so overcome a barrier. Okay. So then looking at the next question, it tells us exactly where to go, and we love that. But keep in mind, with it being reasonably be inferred, it may not be as direct. Just checking one quick thing. Let's skip this one just for now to make sure we have time for science. I want to show you this one because whenever the question says mainly serves to functions, it activates this deeper thought process. Instead, don't worry about that. Instead, think of everything as a summary. You are constantly summarizing, and that's the only thing you do in this reading section. So we're going to take a look at 28 through 30. We're going to just summarize it and see what matches up. So I'm going to start with, where is it, 28 through 30, right here, through here. And they are asking about what's inside the parentheses, okay? So the sentence is, by observing what products form or do not form, he can determine what pathways are possible or not possible for that radical. Okay, so if we break it down, just being very surface level, they're observing something, right? Okay, they're observing something, it's formed, and then inside the parentheses, they're like, oh, or not. So it's another option. Then based on that observation, he can figure something out in terms of pathways that are possible or not possible. So I'm noticing like there's a pattern here. By the way, always look out for repetition. Repetition is never coincidental. So I'm going to speak for myself and ignore those answer choices, even though they're very tempting to look at. Just make sure, let me block them out for us. All right, here's my speak for myself. So it's kind of, so observation leads to figuring out, and then the parentheses offer the alternative. So it's like, do not form, not possible. Notice I'm using almost the same exact language, and that is okay. That is for the best. All right, I'm gonna move that over so we can see what matches. And then most importantly, see what does not match. So A says showcase the difficulty in observing products from the reaction. Never mention difficulty. We can assume it's difficult. It sounds difficult to me, but they didn't literally say it's difficult. So there's no way we can pick that. That's out. B says emphasize how useful information can come from both detecting and not detecting. Now that's more accurate. We'll come back to that one though. Let's just double check the other ones are trash. C says imply that the experiments have a high failure rate. If that's the right answer, then we should see something related to failure. But literally, they don't even say that in the whole paragraph. They do not use that word. They don't say anything related to failing. So there's no way that it can be C. Now, D says specify the research methodology and what is being measured. Well, it is talking about research, but if it's going to specify methodology, it better be specific. And it's not, right? Telling us that you observe products. And also, it's not asking you about the entire sentence. It's just asking you about what's in parentheses. And or do not form, that's not a methodology. Or not possible, that's not a measurement. So there's no way we can go with D. The correct answer has to be B. Okay, I've been throwing a lot of information your way. Please, please, please let me know if you have any questions at all. You can send them directly to me if you're nervous about other people seeing it. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead into the science to make sure that we cover every section. If we have any additional time, we'll jump back in. So let's go ahead onto science. Before we do that, just a quick review. You reorder the passages, start with the one that feels best for you. You reorder the questions, start with the ones that tell you exactly where to go. You work the passage. You have to keep that pencil active. Please do not just read straight through. You are going to zone out. Then when you go back to the question, when it's time to answer them, don't rely on your memory. You're letting the ACT win when you do that, and we don't want to do that, right? I'd rather see you win. So find your window, meaning like find the textual evidence, write the question next to it, and then summarize that textual evidence, kind of like how we just did. You have to speak for yourself. Please, please don't skip that step because then you're letting them guide your thinking. You're kind of walking into those answer choices, not even fully knowing what to look for, which means you're probably going to have to go back to the evidence, and going back and forth is so frustrating. And finally, process of elimination, you are taking out the trash. Look for what is wrong. That is way easier to spot. And the way that you do that, just make a quick point here. Process of elimination, take out what's wrong or take out the trash. So basically, if they didn't mention it in the passage, we can't pick it. It either says it directly or it doesn't. I don't like complimenting this test because I don't think it's the best way to show a, what a student knows or is capable of. But when it comes to this part of it, the reading in particular, it is very direct. It either says it or it doesn't. There's no like reading in between the lines typically. There's also no outside knowledge in this, which brings me to science. So for the science, by the way, there are going to be a few questions that test your scientific knowledge. Like you will not find the answer in the passage, in the graphs. You have to know it. But out of 40 questions, on average, only 3-ish per test are scientific knowledge. Even if you're aiming for high 30s, you don't need those 3 questions to hit that goal. So don't study all the science ever just for those 3 questions. You either know it or you don't. If you don't know it, do not leave it blank. Use your letter of the day. From what I've seen, they like to ask about acids. They like to ask about amino acids and proteins, pH. Usually it tends to be like bio and chem based. I haven't seen too much physics scientific knowledge questions. But again, please don't study all of bio and chem just for those 3 questions. Now, there's usually 6 passages. Here's why we say usually. When we say usually, it's like 99.9% 9-ish% of the time, it's 6. But every 4 or so years, they bring in a 7th passage. But that doesn't mean they're going to add more questions. Instead, they're going to just take a question from each of the other 6 passages to make that 7th one, which is actually a good thing because that means you have less questions per passage. And the passage they're going to the passage they're going to add will only have one experiment. There are passages that have multiple experiments. There's 3 of them. These are going to take a little bit more time. So you're going to want to do these only do after the charts and graphs. And you'll know that it's charts and graphs because it's only one experiment. You'll know it's analyzing experiments because it'll say experiment 1, experiment 2, potentially experiment 3. And then finally, we're leaving the fighting scientists for last because that's kind of like the dual passage. Usually, what I've seen lately is that it's like 3 or 4 small paragraphs that show different points of views. And usually the questions ask about each point of view and then a combination of them. That takes more time, that takes more effort. We want to leave that last. Okay, so here's the challenge. It is very like sciencey. The language is very technical, but you don't really need to know the science. You don't, I promise, aside from those 3 questions. Try not to get bogged down by the science. Do your easiest passages and questions first. Focus on main ideas and trends. Trends are really important here, right? What's increasing, what's decreasing? That's what they like to ask about, right? We only want to spend time doing things that will gain us points. So for example, I'll show you in a little bit. If we do a passage, typically charts and graphs, they have usually a few paragraphs and then some tables and graphs. If none of the questions ask about what the passage is talking about, don't read that passage. So in charts and graphs, don't even read the paragraphs. Go straight to the graphs, go straight to the tables. If a question asks about something beyond the tables, that's when you look at the paragraph. But I'm telling you, that's so rare. And when they do ask for it, usually it'll be whichever phrase is italicized in those paragraphs. Okay. Now, when it comes to the passages with multiple experiments, what you're going to do is you're going to find the differences in the experiments. So let's say that in experiment 1, something increases while something decreases. See if that continues for the second experiment or if that trend changed. A lot of the times the questions are asking for what changed. And then of course, they'll also ask you for what's similar. So let's take a look at this one, for example. Let's practice just marking up the graphics in terms of trends. I'm going to zoom in to table 1. All right, we have mixture names, we have pHs. So I'm seeing that the pHs are increasing. I'm just gonna draw a quick little arrow there. All right, so now here's what I'm seeing. For mixture A, as time went on, the volume of H2 increased, right, for mixture A. For mixture B, as time went on, it also increased. Ooh, try that again. For mixture C, same trend, but I'm noticing that A just had way bigger numbers. So I'm just gonna be mindful of that. Okay, now looking at this figure here, again, I have no idea what it's about, and low-key, I don't really need to know all that. We're doing the least amount of effort, which is again, like the opposite of what you're supposed to do in school. So I'm seeing these 3, like whatever these are on the right-hand side, we don't need to stress all that. As days go on, their volume increases, the volume of H2 increases, and then it plateaus for all 3 of them. But I'm noticing that, where'd it go? This one right here with the long dash and then a dot, this one right here is the highest. So if you see one of them doing something different than the others, solid hint that they're probably going to ask about that one. They love to ask about things that are kind of like standing out from the rest. And when it comes to tables, when it comes to graphs, really important to pay attention to the X and Y axis. Otherwise, we really don't know what they're talking about. Okay. So now let's take a look at number 7. And notice this would be a single experiment, charts and graphs. If it was multiple, it would say experiment 1, experiment 2, potentially experiment 3. We're not reading anything because number 7 only says based on table 1. By the way, whenever it says based on table 1, based on figure 1, according to, start with those questions first because they are just like the detail line reference questions that tell you exactly where to go. When it says based on according to, you should be able to look at the graph and tell the answer right from there. There shouldn't be too much work beyond that. All right, now 7 says based on table 1, which of the following graphs best shows how the volume of H2 produced by the reaction changes over time? Okay, so if we think about the way we mark stuff up, all of these went up. So B, no way can that be the right answer. A does have an increase, so B and D both decrease. I'm going to take both of them out. Now, looking at our options here, let's just double check something. So looking at what happens for, let's say, mixture A, 89 to 176 to 266 to 380. And then B goes from 27 to 48 to 72 to 98. And then C goes from 11 to 17 to 26 to 37. If you look at A and C, one is a little bit more exponential. The other one is linear, meaning that it's going up the same exact amount each time. And what I'm seeing too is that it looks like by day 8, let me just check really quick. Day 6, 80. If we compare it to especially, because all of these are ending at 400, which means we're going to zoom in on mixture A. Okay. So by day 6, it should be about 266. So it should be below 300, right? But if we zoom in on A, day 6 is above 300. For that reason, we're going to get rid of it. The correct answer has to be C. Didn't need to read a thing when it comes to the passage. All right, let's go ahead on to another one. Using that same table, based on table 1, if the volume of H2 produced by day 10 from the mixture C sample had been measured, it would most likely have been, all right, for a question like this, we need to look at the trend and extend it a little bit further because we don't have a day 10, but we know it's going to come after day 8. Right, so day 10 is going to be here. Here's mixture C. We're going to pay attention only to mixture C. And we know that, okay, because it keeps increasing, it has to be above 37. So for that reason, we're going to take out less than 37. Now I'm going to take a look at how much it's been increasing. From 11 to 17, we added 6. From 17 to 26, we added 9. From 26 to 37, we added 11. These are not steep jumps. So if we go from 37 to 72, that's doing way too much. If we go beyond 98, that's really not following the trend we're seeing. So for that reason, H and J are out. G has to be the right answer between 37 and 72. Okay, let's take a look at another one. And then we're going to save a little bit of time at the end for questions and answers. So another according to table 1, that's a question we love. What volume, I don't know about love, but we want to do it first. What volume of H2 was produced by mixture B from the time the volume was measured on day 4 until the time the volume was measured on day 6? Okay, so it says mixture B, and notice they're giving us a lot of components, but I'm taking it just one bit at a time, the same way that I would for the math, right? We don't want to read a word problem and try to digest the entire thing with 3 or 4 sentences. We're zooming in on one part. So I'm going to zoom in only on mixture B, and it talks about day 4 until day 6, so I'm only going to look at that. So it says what volume of H2 was produced by mixture B from the time the volume was measured on day 4 until the time the volume was measured on day 6. So we have to see when we went from 48 to 72, how much was produced in between? which means we're going to have to just subtract. And they're not going to allow you to use calculators on the science. You don't need to use a calculator because in general, it's going to be it's going to be math that should be done without a calculator. Like 72 minus 48, we can do that. Now, full transparency, I put that into my calculator. But if we take a look at our options, it can't be 9. It can't be 72. And the difference between 48 and 72 can't be 90. So low key, we don't even really need to do the math, right? And you can apply that same logic towards the math section. Look at things logically, right? No way can it be A, C, or D, even if we don't actually do the math. All right, now let's take a look. Let me just check one quick thing. I want to show you. Let me see if we have another. Yeah, let's take a look at this one because now we are going to combine a table and a figure. So I'm going to show you the strategy to tackle that successfully. 12 says, consider the volume of H2 produced by mixture A on day 4 that contain no chelating agents. Okay. Now notice chelating agent, we don't have that phrase in the table or the graph. So we may have to go back and look at the text, but most times we can get away without that. So it's saying mixture A, day 4. Great. Okay. Now it says based on table 1 and figure 1, the sample of mixture A containing sucimer produced approximately the same volume of H2 by which of the following days? So in case you're like, it's stressing me out that I don't know what chelating agent is. Totally okay. We can take a look and see if they give us that information. Just check really quick. So right here, 3 different chelating agents. And here are our chelating agents. I don't know what that means. We don't need to know it. So the graph shows it once they add that, the table shows it without it. Now the question is asking, when we add that agent, just check. When we add the agent, when do we hit 176? That is the question. So now we're going to take a look at our volume. Let me really zoom into that. And I'm going to just draw a line. Looking at our intervals, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that means we have things that a little bit less than 20-ish. So maybe 176 has to be, I think, like right around, let me try that again. If I draw that straight across, okay. Now, they're asking about sucimer, so we only need to look at that line. And that's the one with just dash, dash, dash. So looking at that, it looks like the closest option would have to be day 6. 10, 14 are too way ahead. 2 is too low. So we took the information from table 1 first and then used that to figure out the answer for the graph. And what you want to do whenever they ask you about both a table and a figure, look and see what they both have in common with each other. So for example, they both have days, they both have the volumes. So we had to figure out the volume for that day and then look for the volume and days on the graph. Okay, let me just check one quick thing. I think we can do one more question. We'll review the science strategy. I want to make sure we have some time for some questions and answers. We may even have some time to maybe do one more question out of the other sections. So looking at this question, they say in the trials represented in table 1 and figure 1, by measuring the volume of H2, the experimenters were also able to monitor the rate at which, okay, so we do need to look at the table. That's important. And we also need to keep in mind this figure, this information that they give us. Okay, so what were the experimenters able to do? Well, this incorporates just a little bit of outside knowledge, just a little bit, but we see that the arrow is Before the arrow is what they started with, after the arrow is what it converted to. So looking at our options, H for answer choice J, it says that H2SO4 was in the results, and it's not together, right? We have SO4 here, we have H2 there. That's not the same thing. So we can get rid of that. G and H both say that just PB is what we got on the right-hand side. But that's not the case. It has to be answer choice F because we have PB turning into PbSO4. And notice G, H, and J, they're all doing something similar. And that's the main thing, one of the main things on this test. When you see multiple answer choices all doing something similar, red flag, those are probably traps. The correct answer choice usually does something different than the rest. Okay. So just a quick recap in terms of our science strategy, very similar to reading. We reorder the passages, we reorder the questions, we identify trends. And again, you need to mark this up. Don't just look at it and tell yourself it increased. When we physically write things down, it helps to lock in that information that much more. So you're going to actually draw on it and nothing like intense, literally just arrows, arrows. That's all you need to do and focus on main ideas, goals, purposes, really zoom into the question. And then when it comes to those multiple experiments, look for the similarities, look for the differences. And the more you practice, the more you'll be able to even anticipate what they're asking. You'll see they're very repetitive, very repetitive. And something else to keep in mind. If you think about the people who make this test, they are grown adults whose entire job, their entire career revolves around trying to trick high school students. It's kind of sad, right? It's giving sad. We're not gonna let them get in our way, right? Because they're just being petty. And the good thing is that they're petty but not creative. So they repeat the same exact question types. I've even seen a test where a math question was almost the same word for word as a previous official. They literally just changed the numbers. They're that lazy. So you need to take advantage of that. Practice, look for the patterns. Don't be afraid of your missed questions. Yes, it's going to be frustrating. It might discourage you in the moment. You need to miss all your questions right now so you can figure out what to study and how to improve. So please, please don't stress. Be kind to yourself. Just put in the practice. Okay. So a few things before we do a Q&A. Just want to give you a little bit of background on enhanced prep. So the people who make up enhanced prep, we're passionate, we're experienced, and we really just want to help, right? That's why we do these free events. Whether you work with us or not, we just want to make sure that we're contributing to your success in some way because these tests, they're not the most fair, right? They're literally doing things the opposite way that you've been taught to do them throughout your whole academic career. So we just want to be there to help turn your reach into reality and to make you feel like, you know what, you can do this because these tests are also great at making you doubt yourself. So we have the curriculum that's on point, we have our expert instructors, and we're also really transparent. And then just a quick recap in terms of admissions, something to keep in mind. Your test score, ACT or SAT, please don't take both. There is no college that wants both. There is no college that says, oh, you took the ACT, we don't value that as much. That's not going to happen. They're the same exact thing. They just cater to different strengths. So your ACT score is going to make up 20% of your college admissions decision, whereas the rigor of your classes, like how challenging they were, and the GPA that you earn, that's going to be almost half of the decision, which is good, right? It's basically like almost twice as much as your test scores, as it should, right? Like what you do over 3 to 4 years is more important than what you do in one day. But that 20%, still hefty. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, and this is the part that I want you to get excited about, right? View this as a money-making opportunity because this is exactly what that is. 50% of your merit-based merit, right? Not like financial need, merit-based comes from scholarships. There are certain scholarships outside of college, right? A college may look at your score, give you money for it. There's also organizations that will give you money just for a score. If you are in Florida, you can go to state schools for free based on certain scores. Like your entire tuition is covered. Oh, I see a question coming in. Hold on one sec. Yes, of course. That should not be a problem. We're going to send out the annotated notes for sure. I'm going to double check about the recording. We may also have an ACT review on our YouTube site, not YouTube site. If you Google enhanced prep review, you'll see a video, a few of our videos already that cover different subjects and tests. Now, go back to what I mentioned before. Oh, that's right. Some schools in Florida will give you full tuition. Some colleges will also say, oh, okay, based on this score, you don't have to take this class. Usually for like more of the basic core stuff, like you may be able to get out of an English class, like an intro to literary whatever, because of your ACT score, which saves you some tuition credits, I should say. So in terms of your overall application, you're looking at rigor, GPA, academic curiosity, test scores. That's what college admissions look for. They look for how challenging were your classes? Where is your GPA at? What are your test scores looking like? And academic curiosity means like think about the variety of classes that you take. That's what they're looking at. Now, I remember a question before about how I studied when I was in high school. I'm gonna be honest with you, I had no plan. I did not have a plan. And a lot of times, like looking back on it, there were plenty of times where I chose to like chill with my friends instead of studying. And balance is important. Like still chill with your friends, make that time to unwind. But my advice to you is to set certain days of the week to practice at the same time, build that habit up. It takes 21 days to build a habit. In 90 days, it becomes your lifestyle. If you fall into that routine, then you also are able to balance things out a bit better. Please don't study every single day for hours. You're going to burn out. Aim for maybe like every other day, 30 minutes. That's like the sweet spot. Now, we do offer tutoring as well. SAT, ACT, any homework, APs, PSAT, we got you covered. Also, if you're like, oh, I'm taking the ACT, but I'm not sure if it's right for me. Maybe the SAT is better. Reach out to us. We will help you for free. We can give you a free consultation to help you figure out which test is best. Just please don't take both. Don't take both. There are some tutoring companies that recommend that. They're trying to play you. So some prep options. We have an on-demand course, which means that you get to watch videos of every section explained with tips and tricks, and it's on your time. We also have group courses. So we would be going over every section, but in depth. You would get information about each punctuation rule. You would get information about different math concepts. And it also comes with homework, and it comes with practice tests. And then we also have one-on-one tutoring where you have a tutor dedicated to only what you need help with. So we would analyze how you do on a test, and then we would really drill in those concepts in particular. And that also comes with homework. It also comes with practice tests, and all of those practice tests are analyzed. Okay. Oh, hold on one sec. I think I saw another question come in. One sec. Mm-mm. Of course, of course. So there's a question about where I went for undergrad. I actually did not take the ACT. I took the SAT, and I believe I scored, I want to say maybe 2140, 2170 out of 2400 back when it was out of 2400 instead of 1600, and now I feel old, but that's okay. But keep in mind though, when I applied to college, oh my goodness, I'm really feeling old today. That was 2011. 13 years later, or you're a junior now, so like 14 years later, for my sophomore, 15 years later, the landscape looks different. Um, Especially post-COVID, things changed. Because colleges took away the requirement, way more students applied, right? Because a lot of students who didn't hit that goal score, they wouldn't apply. Now they did. But colleges, they don't have more room. It's the same amount of room. So I'm gonna be honest with you. It's a little bit more competitive. And I don't want to add pressure. I just want to be transparent. I would say double check on their website because usually they update their average scores. So use that to guide you more than my score, because we're in a bit of a different situation now. I can't believe that much time passed. Whew. Okay, good question. Even though it made me feel old, it's okay. All right, so those are some options. I'm sorry, we went a little bit over time, so I'm gonna wrap up in just a minute. I don't want to take any more of your time. So for our on-demand course, it's 24 hours of instruction that you get to watch on your time. We're covering every single question type, SAT or ACT. We got it covered. You get quizzes, you get 2 full-length practice tests, and you get access to that course for 6 months. Small group course, $4.99 a student, 12 hours, and you're with an instructor and a tutor live. We're covering the most commonly tested concepts. You're going to get homework that reinforces strategies and content. You're also going to get video recordings. You're going to get annotated notes. And then the course is going to be done the week before your official test. And then we have the one-on-one tutoring, where it's going to go over content, like very specific things that you need help with, not just things that like are commonly tested, but whatever you specifically need help with. We're going to look at strategy in terms of how to approach something more efficiently. And based on your goal score, your tutor is going to help you figure out which questions you need to that are worth your time, which are not, where you want to start, how many questions you want to letter of the day. Your tutor takes care of all of that for you. And also the way that we match our tutors and students is based on personalities. So the advisor will ask what you like to do in your free time, what type of shows, what type of movies you like to watch. And then it'll match you with a tutor with similar interests. And then tutors tend to customize their sessions to incorporate your interests. So it's not just boring and dry. Okay, so just kind of mentioned that before. And we're all about building up your confidence because we can give you all of the, basically all of the content. But if you don't believe in yourself, we're not going to have as much success. Then in terms of some other free events, if you head over to enhancedprep.com, take a look at, hold on one second. There we go. Head over to our events. So we actually just had an SAT strategy session. Another ACT strategy session is coming up Sunday, June 2nd. Then for my juniors in here, personal statement workshop coming up on June 15th. So we'll go over how to write that. If you are interested in the UCs in particular, they have their own essays. We have a session just for that. And again, we have another ACT strategy session on June 23rd. So please feel free to register for any of those. Okay, so the ways that we can help, you can reach out to us for a free 30-minute consultation. Hit up advisor@enhancedprep.com and we can help you figure out anything that you're unsure of in your college application process, academics, anything. We got your back. And also we're going to include a testimonial you can check out from some families who have worked with us. So thank you so much. I'm sorry I went over just a little bit. Thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate you. My name is Olga, and I hope that your studies go well. I hope that you kick some ACT butt. You got this. Please reach out to us if we can help you, okay? Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good luck.